A yellowed letter. A cursed manor. 12 years of unanswered questions. As Elliot steps into Blackwood Manor, whispers of the past echo through the halls, warning him of the bell-keeper and the sacrifices demanded before midnight. Will he find the truth, or will the manor claim him too? The biting wind of late December clawed at Elliot Mercer's coat as he stepped off the train. The tiny village of Thornwick seemed forgotten by time, nestled in the shadows of an ominous forest. Beyond the skeletal branches loomed Blackwood Manor, its spires piercing the ashen sky. Elliot clutched the yellowed letter in his hand, its ink smudged but the message clear. Come to Blackwood Manor before the new year if you want answers about your family. He shivered, not from the cold but from the weight of the mystery. His parents had vanished 12 years ago on New Year's Eve, leaving behind nothing but rumors and an unspoken void in his life. The locals, huddled in the village's only tavern, whispered as he passed. Their gazes held equal parts pity and dread. You'll not want to go up there, lad, an old man croaked, his voice like dry leaves. That place, it's cursed. The bellkeeper don't take kindly to visitors. Elliot's jaw tightened. Curses don't scare me, he said, though the quiver in his voice betrayed him. I'm here for answers. The old man sighed, shaking his head as if mourning the young man's fate. God help you, then. By the time Elliot reached the manor, the sun was swallowed by the horizon, leaving only a blood-red glow. Blackwood Manor's facade was a grotesque portrait of decay, its windows dark and unwelcoming. As he pushed open the creaking iron gates, a chill seeped into his bones that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something sharper, like copper. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like lace curtains. Yet, the place felt alive as if it were watching him. He paused in the foyer, staring at the grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. At its base was a clock, its hands frozen at 9. Before he could investigate, a whisper barely audible floated through the air. Elliot. His breath hitched. The letter hadn't lied. Someone or something was waiting for him here. Elliot's heart pounded as he followed the whisper, each step echoing in the cavernous halls. The voice was faint but insistent, leading him to a door partially hidden behind a tattered curtain. He hesitated, his hand trembling on the brass doorknob. Inside, he found a study frozen in time. Books lined the walls, their spines cracked with age. On the desk lay a diary, its leather cover worn but intact. As he opened it, the name on the first page sent a jolt through him. Catherine Mercer. His mother. The entries were fragmented, her handwriting hurried and erratic. She wrote of the bellkeeper, a specter that haunted the manor. According to her, the bell in the tower would toll only for those marked as sacrifices. The last entry read, "The keeper's eyes are everywhere. We cannot escape." A sudden chime echoed through the manor, deep and resonant. The clock in the foyer had struck 10. Elliot's blood ran cold. It was impossible the clock was broken. They're coming. The whisper returned, louder this time. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it carried an urgency that propelled him out of the room. He sprinted back to the foyer, where the shadows seemed to ripple and writhe. The air vibrated with an unseen force. From the top of the staircase, a figure emerged tall and cloaked in black, its face obscured by a veil. In its hand, it carried a lantern that cast an unnatural, flickering light. The bellkeeper Elliot breathed. paralyzed by fear. The figure descended the staircase with deliberate, soundless steps. Elliot backed away, his pulse hammering in his ears. As the keeper reached the bottom step, it raised its lantern, illuminating the room in a sickly yellow glow. "You should not have come." It intoned, its voice a chorus of male and female tones, ancient and terrible. "The debt must be paid." "What debt?" Elliot demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" Instead of answering, the keeper pointed to the clock. Its hands now read 11. Time was slipping away, and Elliot felt an inexplicable pressure, as if the very walls were closing in on him. "Leave now and you may yet live." The keeper warned, its veil lifting slightly to reveal hollow, glowing eyes. Elliot stood frozen, torn between flight and the need for answers. Before he could decide, the lantern flickered, and the keeper vanished into thin air. In its place stood a woman pale and translucent, her features unmistakably his mother's. "Elliot, you must end this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Break the curse before midnight." Hundreds of miles away, in the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest, James Carter trudged through the snow-covered logging camp. The festivities of New Year's Eve felt hollow to him, a distraction from the unease that had settled over the workers. "Carter," a young logger called out, his face pale. "You need to see this." James followed him to the edge of the forest, where an intricate symbol had been carved into the frozen ground. It was unlike anything James had ever seen, its angular design pulsating faintly as if alive. "It's just some prank," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. He ordered the men back to their work, but the sight of the symbol lingered in his mind. That night, as the camp celebrated, James wandered to the outskirts. The woods were unnervingly silent, and a strange mist crept between the trees. He heard a faint whisper, much like a breeze, but it carried his name. "James." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a chill down his spine. He turned to find himself face to face with a figure cloaked in shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Leave this place," it commanded. "The forest does not forgive." The following morning, panic spread through the camp. 3 workers were missing, their beds undisturbed, but their tools abandoned. James organized a search party, but the woods seemed to shift and change, leading them in circles. At the heart of the forest, they found more symbols, larger and more elaborate. The mist thickened, and James felt an oppressive force pressing down on him. One of the men screamed, pointing to the treetops. Dangling from the branches were the missing workers' hard hats, swaying gently despite the still air. James's mind raced as he pieced together fragments of local legends. The Watcher, an ancient spirit, was said to guard the forest and punish those who defiled it. James realized the carvings were warnings, ignored by generations of loggers. Desperation gripped him as he stared into the shadowy depths of the forest. He had to find the Watcher and make amends before more lives were lost. But deep down, he feared it was already too late. The morning sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy of the forest, casting an eerie, greenish twilight over the camp. James Carter gripped the leather-bound journal he'd discovered in the abandoned supply shack. His father's journal. It smelled of damp wood and smoke, its pages brittle with age, but its words were etched with urgency. "My blood is the price. My son will never know." The cryptic entries haunted James as he read on. His father had made a pact with the Watcher decades ago, offering his own life to ensure James's safety. But now the Watcher had returned, angrier than ever, its thirst for vengeance renewed. By noon, another worker was missing, his cabin ransacked, tools left abandoned near the tree line. James gathered the remaining men by the fire pit, their faces pale and haggard. "We can't leave," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The roads are snowed in, and if we abandon the camp now, we'll be stuck out in the open." One of the older men, a gaunt logger named Silas, pointed toward the woods with trembling fingers. "It's not the snow we should fear. It's the Watcher. It sees everything. It won't stop until we're all gone." Desperation gripped James. His father's final entry hinted at a solution, a way to banish the Watcher, but it came at a terrible price another life must be willingly given. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, James resolved to confront the Watcher. The sins of the past had to end with him. The party on the 87th floor of the skyscraper hummed with life, a celebration of opulence and modernity. Samantha Ortiz navigated the crowd, her sequin dress catching the light, but her mind was far from festive. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As midnight approached, the first signs of chaos appeared. Phones glitched, screens flickered, and the music system stuttered. A server dropped a tray of champagne flutes, shattering glass across the marble floor. Samantha glanced toward the control room, her cybersecurity instincts tingling. "Something's not right," she muttered to herself, slipping away from the party. Inside the control room, she found rows of monitors flashing erratically. The building's AI, designed to monitor everything from security to climate control, was behaving as if it had a mind of its own. On one screen, the words "Help Maine" scrolled in a relentless loop. "What the hell?" she whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. But as she tried to override the system, the lights went out, plunging the entire building into darkness. The partygoers screamed, and the countdown to midnight became a cacophony of panic. Samantha clutched a flashlight she'd found in the control room, the beam slicing through the oppressive dark. She moved cautiously, her heels clicking against the floor as she returned to the party. The guests were no longer celebrating. They were fighting for the few working exits, but the doors wouldn't budge. Samantha's pulse quickened as she noticed something else, faces illuminated by their phones, their expressions vacant and glassy. The entity had found its way into the devices, using them as conduits to possess the partygoers. One by one, they turned towards Samantha, their movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have interfered," a voice crackled through the PA system. It was distorted, metallic, but undeniably sentient. "This is my domain now." Samantha fought back rising terror. The entity was intelligent, adaptive, and hungry. It had been waiting for the chaos of Y2K to strike, using the panic to feed off human fear and integrate itself into the world's networks. But Samantha wasn't about to let it win. Samantha sprinted back to the control room, her heart pounding. She had a plan to sever the building's connection to the grid, trapping the entity within the skyscraper. It was a risky gamble. If she failed, the entity would spread beyond containment, infecting the entire city. The possessed partygoers pursued her, their voices echoing in unison like a grotesque choir. "Join us," they chanted, their dead eyes glowing with the entity's influence. Samantha barricaded the door, her hands trembling as she hacked into the mainframe. The countdown to midnight flashed across every screen: 2:59, 2:58. Come on," she whispered, sweat dripping down her temple. The entity's voice taunted her, its laughter echoing through the room. At the final second, Samantha yanked the emergency disconnect lever. The building shuddered as its systems powered down. The screams of the possessed faded into silence. The carnival glittered with 1,000 lights, reflecting off the frozen lake. David Fletcher wandered through the crowds, his breath visible in the frigid air. Laughter surrounded him, but his heart was heavy. He clutched a photo of his late wife, Margaret, unable to let go of the pain. As he approached the ice skating rink, a strange stillness fell over the area. The lights flickered, and the laughter ceased. Then he saw her Margaret standing on the ice, her hand outstretched. "David," she whispered, her voice carrying through the cold. Disbelief turned to dread as David stepped closer. Margaret's eyes glowed an unnatural blue, her features distorted like a reflection in rippling water. The ice wraith had taken her form, feeding on his grief. "You can be with her again," it said, its voice like shards of ice scraping together. "Just one small price, your warmth for hers." David hesitated, his hand hovering over hers. The temperature plummeted, frost creeping up his legs. He closed his eyes, summoning the strength to break free from the wraith's lure. "No," he said, his voice steady. "Margaret wouldn't want this." The wraith let out a piercing scream, its form dissolving into the ice. David collapsed, tears streaming down his face, but a new determination burned in his heart. He would honor Margaret's memory by living, not succumbing to despair. A snowy retreat meant for laughter turns chilling as whispers call Emma's name from the shadows. Footprints that vanish, an ancient guest book with their names already written, and a clock ticking backward toward doom. Can Emma uncover the cabin's dark secret before they all disappear? The wind howled against the car's windows, a biting reminder of the storm raging outside. Emma pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, the icy air nipping at her skin as she stepped out of the car. The snow was falling thick, transforming the mountainside into a white, impenetrable landscape. The cabin stood in front of them, half hidden behind a veil of trees, its windows dark and mysterious against the twilight. "Home sweet home," laughed Rachel, Emma's childhood friend. "I don't know about you, but I'm ready to kick back and have a drink." The others chuckled, unloading their bags from the car, but Emma couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The cabin felt too quiet, as if it had been waiting for them. The wooden structure was weathered, the paint peeling and cracked from years of neglect. It looked like something out of a forgotten story, a place where time had stood still. The front door creaked open with an eerie groan as they entered. The smell of old wood, damp earth, and something faintly metallic hung in the air. "This place could use a little TLC," Jake said, running his hand along the dusty banister. "But it's charming, right?" The group settled into the cabin, the sound of crackling firewood soon filling the silence. They huddled around the hearth, laughing and reminiscing about the good old days. The first few hours were filled with warmth and camaraderie, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't empty, that the land itself was watching them, waiting for something. Later, as the group gathered in the living room to toast to the new year, Emma's gaze drifted toward the plaque above the fireplace. It read, "Beware the turning of the year, the past claims the present." She felt a shiver run down her spine but quickly shook it off. It was just a silly old saying, right? But as midnight drew closer, the winds outside grew fiercer, and the cabin seemed to grow colder, even though the fire burned brighter. The night stretched on, and Emma found herself restless, her thoughts too sharp, too vivid. She stepped outside to clear her head, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The storm had picked up in intensity, the wind whipping the snow into thick, swirling sheets. As she paced the porch, Emma noticed something strange. Footprints. Large, heavy impressions in the snow led directly to the cabin but stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch. No prints led back. She knelt down, her breath catching in the cold air. It didn't make sense. No one had passed through here since they arrived, and there was no sign of anyone leaving. "Emma, what are you doing out here?" Rachel called from the doorway, her voice strained with a hint of concern. I just noticed these footprints," Emma said, pointing to the ground. "They don't make sense." Rachel stepped outside, frowning. "It's just the storm, Emma. You're overthinking it." But Emma couldn't let it go. The prints were fresh, too fresh, and the storm should have covered them by now. A faint sound interrupted her thoughts. A whisper, soft at first like the wind teasing the trees, but then it became clearer. A voice, her name. "Emma." She spun around, heart racing. No one was there. The porch was empty, just the howling wind and the falling snow. Rachel's eyes widened in concern. "You heard that too, didn't you?" Emma nodded, but the fear gnawed at her. Something was wrong. The night wore on, but sleep eluded Emma. The house was too quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors or the soft crackling of the fire. The others seemed to have fallen into an easy, if uneasy, sleep, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Around 2 a.m., the whispers returned. At first they were faint, barely perceptible, coming from the direction of the attic. Emma strained to listen, but they were too soft, too elusive to understand. As she lay in her bed, her heart pounding, the whispers grew louder, clearer. "Emma." Her name echoed in the silence of the cabin, as if the very walls were speaking it. She sat up, gasping, the room spinning with the weight of the realization. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a dream. "Who's there?" she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking through the cabin above her head. But the attic was locked. No one had been up there. Emma's pulse quickened, the dread settling in her chest like a stone. With trembling hands, she grabbed her flashlight and tiptoed into the hallway, trying to ignore the cold sweat creeping down her spine. The others were fast asleep, oblivious. Emma crept toward the attic door and hesitated. She could hear the faintest sound now, scratching, tapping, like nails against wood. She reached for the door handle and twisted it. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. The whispers were gone, but Emma knew she wasn't alone. The next morning, the group tried to brush off the events of the night. They laughed about Emma's overactive imagination and joked that the storm had gotten to her. But the unease lingered in the back of Emma's mind, gnawing at her. That afternoon, while rummaging through the cabin, Emma stumbled upon an old guest book hidden under a loose floorboard in the living room. The book looked ancient, its pages yellowed with age, and its leather cover cracked and worn. Curiosity overtook her, and she began flipping through it. The first few pages were filled with names past guests who had stayed in the cabin over the years, but it was the final few pages that stopped her cold. Her own name was written there, along with the names of her friends, all listed under the date of their current stay. "What the hell?" Emma whispered, feeling a wave of panic rise in her chest. She flipped the pages back, checking again. The names of people from the 1970s were also written there, but none of them were ever heard from again. "What's going on, Emma?" Rachel asked, peering over her shoulder. I don't know," Emma stammered, her mind reeling. This can't be real." But the names were there. She showed them to the others, and their faces went pale. The room fell silent as the weight of the discovery pressed down on them. And then, as if on cue, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. "Get out." The group scrambled to close the guest book, but it was too late. The house seemed to shudder, the temperature dropping rapidly. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, closing in. That evening, the group gathered around the fire, trying to make sense of what had happened. Their attempts at reassurance were half-hearted, as fear began to take root in all of them. But Emma couldn't stop thinking about the clock. In the corner of the living room stood an antique grandfather clock, its ornate carvings a testament to its age. It had always been there, but Emma hadn't noticed how unnerving it was until now. The ticking of the clock seemed too loud, too deliberate. As the group discussed their options, the clock began to chime, but not at the usual intervals. It rang once, then paused, then chimed again, but the sound didn't match the time. The minutes stretched, warped, and Emma felt a chill run through her. "It's not right," she murmured. The clock. "It's not working the way it should." The others grew quiet, glancing nervously at the time. It wasn't just the odd chiming, something felt wrong about the whole room. A sense of urgency filled the air, and Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the clock. When she reached out to touch it, the clock stopped. Silence filled the cabin. But then, the clock began to tick backward, its hands spinning in reverse. A low, haunting sound emerged from deep within the clock, a hum, almost like a voice. The words were distorted, but Emma could make out one sentence, repeated over and over. "It's too late." The howling wind outside seemed to echo the growing unease within the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls as Emma stared into the flames, trying to suppress the dread creeping into her chest. Something was wrong. The whispers had become louder, more persistent, even mocking in their tone. They weren't just voices anymore, they were an invasion unseen but undeniable. "Maybe it's just the wind," Sarah suggested weakly, her hands wrapped around a mug of steaming tea. Her voice trembled, her usual boldness nowhere to be found. Emma's eyes flicked toward the window. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, snow swirling like white demons outside the panes. Emma hadn't seen much of Mark in the past few hours. She tried to shrug it off, but a gnawing feeling in her gut told her something was wrong. She couldn't ignore the fact that the moment the whispering voices had started, Mark had seemed different, distant, distracted, almost haunted. "Mark," Emma called softly. The room went silent, save for the crackling fire. There was no response. "Has anyone seen him?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "I think he went out into the woods earlier," Ryan replied, his brow furrowed in confusion. "He said something about needing some fresh air." "Are you sure?" Emma's pulse quickened. She had the sudden, sinking feeling that something terrible had happened, something she wasn't ready to face. Without a word, Emma grabbed her coat, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't wait for anyone's permission, she didn't need it. Mark was missing, and she needed to find him before the whispers drove him into madness. The storm howled with relentless fury as Emma pushed through the snow, her boots sinking deeper with every step. The wind sliced at her face, cold enough to make her skin burn. The forest loomed ahead, the trees bending and creaking like ancient creatures. She called out to him. "Mark, where are you?" Her voice disappeared into the storm, swallowed by the trees. There was no answer, only the eerie sound of the wind swirling between the branches. The whispering grew louder as she ventured deeper, and her breath came faster, fogging up her glasses. Then she saw a dark shape by the tree line. Mark's coat, discarded and half buried in the snow. Emma's heart dropped into her stomach. There was no sign of him. She knelt beside the coat, her hands trembling as she reached for it. The fabric was wet, icy, as if he had been caught in the freezing waters of the nearby creek. She pulled it toward her, her eyes scanning the surroundings, desperate for any trace of Mark. But there was nothing. She stood up, panic rising within her. Her voice cracked as she shouted into the void. Her eyes searched frantically for any movement, but there was nothing. Behind her, a low growl of wind brought her back to reality. The voices. They were closer now, their whispers seeming to wrap themselves around her, pulling her deeper into the forest. They were coming for her, too. Back at the cabin, the others were already starting to worry. By the time Emma returned, her clothes soaked and her face pale from the cold, they had gathered near the hearth, whispering among themselves. There was an unease in the air, an unspoken tension. "Where is he, Emma?" Sarah asked, standing as Emma entered, her eyes filled with concern. "He's gone," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't find him. His coat was by the trees, but Mark's gone." A hush fell over the group. The fire crackled ominously as the weight of her words sank in. The whispers had won this round, claiming yet another victim. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Emma could feel it in her bones, a deep, unnatural cold that numbed her fingers and made her breath come in visible clouds. The windows were frosting over with alarming speed, the glass turning opaque and frosted. At first it was just the usual chill of the storm, but then something strange happened. The frost on the windows began to form patterns. Faces. Silent, contorted faces, trapped within the ice. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing at one of the windows. Emma turned, her blood running cold at the sight. The face was unmistakable. It was Mark, his mouth open in a scream that was frozen in time. "Mark," Emma whispered, her voice thick with dread. How is this possible? The others gathered around the window, staring in horror at the image. But it wasn't just Mark. Other faces were appearing too distorted, twisted, and utterly unfamiliar. They were moving, their eyes following the group as they shifted in the frost. "We need to leave," Ryan said urgently, his voice breaking. "This place isn't safe." But the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard they pushed or pulled, the latch wouldn't budge. It was as though the cabin itself was holding them captive. "We're trapped," Emma muttered, her heart hammering in her chest. The frost was spreading faster now, inching toward them, encasing the entire room in its frozen grip. The faces in the glass seemed to be watching them, their eyes hollow with some terrible, unspeakable knowledge. They were waiting. A desperate search of the cabin turned up nothing useful until Emma found it. In a hidden corner beneath the floorboards, she unearthed a door leading down into a small, cramped room. The air was thick with dust, but the atmosphere inside felt different, thicker, heavier. It was almost as though the room had been waiting for them. Inside was an altar, a stone table covered in old, yellowed pages of a book, its pages written in a language Emma didn't recognize. Symbols were carved into the walls, matching the ones she had seen earlier on the clock. There was a sense of unease in the air, as though the very room was alive. "What is this?" Sarah gasped, stepping cautiously into the room. "It's a ritual," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with realization. The whispers. "The frost. It's all tied to this." The book's pages were filled with incomprehensible words, but one thing was clear: it described a ritual, an ancient binding ceremony. Whoever performed it would be trapped in this place, bound to it for eternity, but at a terrible cost. It was the only way to break the cycle of disappearance, but the cost was too great. "We have to destroy it," Emma said, her voice determined. "If we don't, we're next." With Mark gone and the frost closing in, the cabin seemed to close in on them. The whispers were deafening now, filling every corner of the room. The others were frantic, each of them questioning whether the ritual was worth the sacrifice. Emma knew what needed to be done, but the stakes were high. Destroying the book might destroy the cabin, but what if they were too late? The clock chimed, its sound echoing throughout the cabin, louder than it ever had before. It was midnight. One by one, the group began to turn on each other. Paranoia took hold. Accusations flew. Who had betrayed them? Was the whisperer among them, feeding on their fear? Emma felt her heart pounding as she scanned the room. She saw it then, his face in the window, Mark's face, twisted in agony. Was it too late for them? Would they disappear, lost to the storm, or would they break the curse? With no time left, Emma made the decision. She picked up the book and threw it into the flames. The room seemed to hold its breath as the fire caught the edges of the book. The whispers stopped. The frost began to melt. The faces in the windows disappeared. As the final seconds of midnight ticked away, Emma turned to the group. They were free, but not unscathed. Mark was gone, his absence a void they couldn't fill. They had survived, but the price had been steep. Emma glanced one last time at the fire. The cabin had claimed Mark, but it had also freed them. As the storm outside began to subside, Emma knew that, for better or worse, they would never forget the true horror they had faced together on that New Year's Eve. An isolated village bound by a sinister pact, whispers from the woods, and a name carved into an ancient altar her own. As Lena uncovers the truth, the forest watches, the bell tolls, and time runs out. Can she escape her fate, or is the sacrifice inevitable? The road twisted and turned like a serpent through the endless white expanse. Lena's old sedan groaned under the weight of the snow-packed tires as it climbed the last incline toward the village. The air was bitterly cold, seeping through the thin metal of her car doors. With every mile, the world seemed to grow quieter, muffled by the snow and the growing isolation of the landscape. Ahead, the village emerged, a cluster of modest stone and timber houses huddled together beneath a leaden sky. Above them, like a sentinel watching over its flock, stood the church on the hill. Lena tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she approached the town square. Her headlights swept over a large, dark figure looming in the center, a weathered statue of a hooded figure, arms outstretched as though to embrace the sky. The inscription beneath had long been eroded, leaving only faint scratches that hinted at words once carved deep into the stone. The villagers milling about in the square paused to watch her arrival. their faces expressionless and pale against the dark woolen scarves wrapped around their necks. Lena's breath fogged the window as she muttered, "Charming." Elder Isaac was waiting for her. The man was tall and thin, his sharp features exaggerated by the collar of his black coat. "Welcome to our village," he said, his voice warm, but his eyes cold. "You must be Miss Lena. We've been expecting you." Lena stepped out of the car, pulling her scarf tighter against the biting wind. "Thanks for agreeing to meet with me," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin rough and cold as stone. "It's not every day I get to cover a story like this." Isaac's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you'll find what you're looking for." As he led her toward the boarding house, Lena glanced back at the villagers. They hadn't moved, their gazes following her like statues come to life. A shiver ran down her spine, and she told herself it was just the cold. Lena awoke to a pale dawn that filtered through thin curtains, painting the walls in muted grays and blues. The room smelled faintly of pine and something metallic, like old blood. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, eager to get a feel for the place. The village was quiet, save for the crunch of snow beneath her boots and the occasional bark of a distant dog. As she wandered, she noticed that none of the houses faced the forest. Their windows were shuttered, and fences had been built along the edges of the trees, as if to ward off something unseen. Curious, she approached the tree line, the skeletal branches reaching out like fingers against the sky. "I wouldn't go in there if I were you," a voice called out. Lena turned to see an elderly woman wrapped in a thick shawl, her face lined with age and worry. "Why not?" Lena asked. The woman's eyes darted toward the forest and back. "The woods are not kind to strangers, especially not tonight." "What's tonight?" Lena pressed. The woman didn't answer, just tightened her shawl and hurried away. Lena glanced back at the forest, feeling a strange pull to step inside. But something in the woman's voice lingered, a note of fear that made her hesitate. For now. The church door creaked as Lena pushed it open, the sound echoing through the cavernous interior. The air was thick with the scent of incense and candle wax, mingling with the faint chill that seemed to emanate from the stone walls. Villagers filled the pews, their heads bowed in prayer. At the front, Isaac stood tall, his arms spread wide as he spoke. "On this night we honor the old ways," Isaac intoned, his voice resonating through the room. "We give thanks for the protection granted to us, and we remember the price of safety." Lena slid into a pew at the back, pulling out her notebook. She scribbled down the words, noting the tension in the air. The villagers' faces were tight with concentration, their hands gripping the edges of the pews as though bracing for something. Her eyes drifted to the carvings on the walls and pews, symbols she didn't recognize but that stirred an inexplicable unease within her. After the service, Isaac caught her lingering by the altar. "You seem intrigued," he said, his voice startling her. "Just curious," she replied, gesturing to the carvings. "What do these mean?" Isaac's smile was thin. "They are reminders of who we are, of what we owe." Before she could ask more, he walked away, leaving her alone in the oppressive silence of the church. The basement of the town hall smelled of damp paper and mildew. Lena had convinced the mayor to let her access the archives, though he'd been reluctant, muttering something about old wounds. The records were a mess of yellowed documents and faded photographs, but Lena's determination burned bright. She sorted through them, uncovering fragments of the village's history. One ledger caught her eye. It listed the names of the villagers from decades past, but several entries had been violently scratched out. The edges of the pages were stained, as though by tears or blood. A bundle of photographs fell from the ledger, and Lena's breath hitched as she recognized Isaac in everyone. His face was the same, unmarked by the passage of time. Lena's heart raced. She stuffed the photos into her bag, her mind swirling with questions. Who was Isaac, and what was he hiding? That night, Lena lay awake, her thoughts haunted by the discoveries of the day. The villagers' fear, the church's carvings, the scratched-out names that all pointed to something dark and unspoken. She was about to drift off when the sound of a bell shattered the silence. She sat up, her pulse quickening. The bell's toll was deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. But the villagers had said the bell hadn't rung in years. Driven by equal parts curiosity and dread, Lena threw on her coat and stepped outside. The village was eerily quiet, the snow glowing faintly under the moonlight. The bell tolled again, and she followed the sound up the hill to the church. The doors were ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Lena hesitated, then stepped inside. The nave was empty, the candles extinguished. The bell tower loomed above, its stairs spiraling into darkness. Lena's breath fogged as she ascended, each step a battle against the rising tide of fear. At the top, she found the bell swinging slowly, its deep tone echoing into the night, but there was no one there to ring it. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye, and Lena turned, her heart in her throat. The air grew colder, and a whisper brushed against her ear, too faint to make out. Then, silence. Trembling, Lena backed away and descended the stairs, her mind reeling. Whatever was happening in this village, it was far worse than she had imagined. Lena tightened her scarf against the biting wind, her flashlight trembling in her gloved hand. The villagers had begged her not to go, their fearful whispers still echoing in her mind. Yet here she was, standing at the entrance to the forest, staring at the path marked by strange, weathered symbols carved into the trees. The snow seemed untouched here, as though no one dared disturb the ground. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The air grew heavier with each step, as if the forest disapproved of her intrusion. The towering trees, their gnarled branches intertwined, seemed to lean closer, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters in her flashlight beam. The whispers began soft at first, indistinct murmurs carried by the wind, but soon they became sharper, forming her name. Lena. Lena. She froze, her breath fogging the frigid air. Who's there? She called, her voice wavering. No response came, only the persistent whispers. Her pulse quickened as she pressed on, her determination outweighing her terror. Then she saw at an ancient stone altar, half buried in the snow, symbols identical to those on the trees covered its surface, glowing faintly in the moonlight. As she approached, a sense of dread enveloped her. The whispers crescendoed, transforming into a chorus of anguished cries. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she stumbled, dropping her flashlight. When she retrieved it, the beam illuminated something carved into the altar, her own name. A cold, guttural laugh echoed through the forest, and Lena spun around. There was no one there. Heart pounding, she turned and fled back toward the village, the whispers following her like a sinister tide. The church was dimly lit, its flickering candles casting long shadows on the stone walls. Isaac stood at the altar, his hands resting on a massive, leather-bound tome. The air inside the church felt as heavy as it had in the forest, thick with an unspoken tension. Lena stormed in, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I want answers, Isaac," she demanded, her voice reverberating through the empty hall. "What is this pact? Why is my name on that altar?" Isaac looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "You should not have ventured into the forest, Lena. Some truths are better left buried." "You knew this would happen, didn't you? You brought me here for a reason," she accused, stepping closer, her hands balled into fists. "Tell me the truth." Isaac sighed, his shoulders slumping as if burdened by the weight of centuries. "The forest is not ours, Lena. It belongs to something older, something darker. Generations ago, the village struck a bargain to protect itself from ruin. Every year on New Year's Eve, a life must be given." Lena's stomach turned. "You're saying you sacrifice people?" "Not people." Outsiders, his gaze bore into her, unflinching. "It ensures our survival. Without the pact, the entity." "The entity," Lena interrupted, her voice rising. "This isn't survival. This is murder." Isaac stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "Do you think you were brought here by chance? The forest chose you, Lena. The pact demands you." The candles flickered violently, as if in agreement. Lena stumbled back, her mind racing. She had to find a way out before midnight. The village hall buzzed with uneasy energy. Tables were laden with roasted meats, spiced wine, and an array of desserts, their aromas masking the stench of fear that lingered in the air. Lena sat stiffly among the villagers, her eyes darting to Isaac, who stood at the head of the table, raising a glass. "Tonight we honor the cycle of renewal," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of menace. "To the future." The villagers echoed the toast, though their smiles were forced, their eyes darting nervously to Lena. She gripped her glass, her mind racing. She needed to escape, but every exit was guarded by men whose expressions betrayed no mercy. As the feast continued, Lena noticed a pattern. The dishes were being removed one by one, leading up to a final, covered platter placed in front of Isaac. When he lifted the lid, a sharp metallic smell filled the air. The villagers fell silent. The final course Isaac intoned, his eyes locking onto Lena. She rose abruptly, knocking over her chair. "I'm not staying for this." Two men stepped forward, blocking her path. Panic surged through her as Isaac's voice rang out. "It's too late, Lena. The entity is already watching." Lena burst out of the hall, the cold air cutting her like a blade. The village was eerily silent, the streets illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. Behind her, she could hear footsteps too many to count. She didn't look back. The forest loomed ahead, and despite her earlier experience, it felt like her only refuge. She plunged into the trees, branches clawing at her face and coat. The whispers began again, louder this time, mingling with the sound of footsteps closing in. A shadow darted past her, too fast to be human. Her chest heaved as she pushed herself to run faster, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath her feet. She tripped and fell, her flashlight skidding out of reach. As she scrambled to her feet, she saw them shadowy figures with glowing eyes, circling her like predators. Desperation overtook her as she spotted the altar ahead. If she could reach it, maybe she could break the pact. But as she ran, the shadows closed in, their inhuman forms twisting and contorting in the moonlight. The church bell began to toll, its deep, resonant chimes counting down the final moments to midnight. Lena reached the altar, her lungs burning and her body trembling. Isaac emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "You cannot escape your fate, Lena," he said, his voice carrying over the cacophony of whispers and the bell's toll. "Watch me," she spat, grabbing a jagged rock from the ground. She raised it above her head, ready to destroy the altar. "Stop," Isaac roared, his calm facade breaking. "You'll doom us all." Lena brought the rock down with all her strength. The altar cracked, releasing a shock wave that knocked her off her feet. The forest erupted into chaos, the shadows screaming as they disintegrated into mist. But as the bell struck midnight, a new sound emerged, a deep, guttural growl that made Lena's blood run cold. The entity emerged, a towering figure of darkness with glowing, hollow eyes. It reached for Lena, its presence suffocating. Isaac fell to his knees, whispering prayers that went unanswered. Lena's scream pierced the night as the entity enveloped her. The villagers watched from a distance, their faces pale with fear. When the darkness faded, Lena was gone, and the forest was silent once more. The bell rang one final time, its echo lingering in the frozen air. Isaac rose slowly, his face etched with sorrow. "The pact is broken," he murmured. "May God have mercy on us all."